Good afternoon, everyone. We're at our last session of the day, Economic Competitiveness, Unleashing the Power of Free Enterprise. Today we have our panelists being moderated today by Sandra Watson. Sandra is an economic development professional with 33 years of leadership experience in business attraction and expansion, innovation, entrepreneurship, economic policy, and workforce development. Since 2011, Ms. Watson and her teams have worked with more than 1,117 companies that are committed to creating more than 267,000 quality jobs and investing more than $113 billion in capital in the state. Currently, Ms. Watson serves as the president and CEO of the Arizona Commerce Authority, a public-private partnership that leads statewide economic development. The unique structure of the ACA brings together leaders from private industry, academia, and all three branches of state government. In addition to working on numerous boards, Ms. Watson previously oversaw the Arizona Workforce Council and was the director of the Arizona Office of Economic Opportunity, a data-driven team focused on economic and labor market analysis. Danny Seaton. Danny brings more than 16 years of experience in global public affairs and government relations, as well as handling complex legal matters in private practice and public sector service. Prior to joining the Arizona Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Danny was the general counsel to the Valor Global Leadership Team. He focused on helping achieve growth objectives, as well as providing continued public affairs guidance in Arizona, Washington, and other states. Danny served as Deputy Chief of Staff for Arizona Governor Doug Ducey from 2014 to 2018, where he assisted in the passage of landmark legislation, including the Arizona Opioid Epidemic Act and K-12 education funding ballot referrals. Danny earned his JD from the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law at ASU and a Bachelor of Arts from Pepperdine University. Danny also serves as an adjunct professor at the College of Law here at ASU and is a board member of numerous community organizations. And then finally, Derek Miller is the president and CEO of the Salt Lake Chamber and Downtown Alliance. The Chamber is the state's largest and longest-serving business association that stands as the voice of businesses. In this role, Derek leads the business community in advocating and leading Utah's continued economic prosperity. Previously, Derek served as the president and CEO of the World Trade Center Utah, helping to promote international business across the state. He also served as chief of staff for Governor Herbert, and as managing director of the Governor's Office of Economic Development for Governor Huntsman. Recognizing his leadership, Governor Herbert lauded Derek as an architect of economic opportunity and innovation, and instrumental in transforming Utah into one of the most competitive and fastest growing communities in the country. Derek began his career in Washington, D.C. as a management consultant with Arthur Andersen and as a legal counsel for the U.S. House of Representatives. He is a graduate of the J. Reuben Clark Law School and holds a Master of Public Administration from the Omni Institute of Public Management at Brigham Young University. Please give our panel a warm welcome round of applause. And feel free, take it away.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Mason. And thank you to all of you for being here today. I'm excited to be talking about economic development and economic liberty. So really do appreciate the work that ASU is doing here and the Center for the Study of Economic Liberty for hosting the panel today. So let's jump right in. I've got some questions for Derek and Danny, and we'll have a robust conversation and we'll take some questions at the end. Red tape and government bureaucracy make it difficult for small businesses and entrepreneurs to start and grow their companies. In Arizona, we have launched the Arizona Business One Stop, an easily accessible online location for small businesses and entrepreneurs to plan, start, and grow their business, eliminating red tape and streamlining the process. How are your organizations and local areas helping to reduce those barriers to entry, and what are the benefits to easing that burden for businesses and entrepreneurs? And we'll start with Danny.
I feel like you answered the question with the question in a lot of ways. The Arizona Business One Stop it was a great innovation that we've had in the past decade that anybody who wants to start a business can find how to do that with relative ease. But what we do at the Chamber to help support that, again, unfortunately, the Arizona Business One Stop is not enough. There still are local issues you have to deal with sometimes, and we want to make sure that we support those businesses as they navigate through licensing issues and through local regulations. We're a state that's very unique. We have things called charter cities. Cities here have a lot of influence sometimes, and sometimes that their regulations are higher than that at the state level. In fact, most times they are that way. So we continue to fight to work when we can with our cities, but sometimes we have to go do a little bit more political battle with them to make sure that they are not standing in the way of these great economic wins that the Commerce Authority or the state legislature has passed policies to help create. So there's policies at the state level and policies at the city level. I think we're going to continue to push through good policies at the city level.
Great. And before we go to Derek, we also did something interesting in Arizona with the FinTech Sandbox. Do you want to?
Sure. It's really interesting because we were just talking about driverless cars. So I'll use that as a way to back into that.
Yeah.
Those of you who aren't from Arizona, or if you watch this at home, you're not from Arizona, they don't really believe that we have autonomous vehicles here yet until you get here and you walk around and see there's plenty of autonomous vehicles going on. I could pull out Waymo One right now on my phone and show it to you. They're a great chamber board member. That happened again, because of policy started at the statewide level. We created a regulatory sandbox to allow for testing of autonomous vehicles. We believe that they are safer. And it might be scary to look at the car next to you and see no one in it. I think it's scary to look at the car next to you and see someone staring at their phone the entire time, which is really all you see, right? If you stare around. So something we did similar was with the fintech. When blockchain first came out and everyone was trying to figure out how to use this or how to regulate it, we kind of went the other way. We created a regulatory sandbox so there could be freedom for innovators to come in and come to Arizona, invest in us. And we drew so much interest from the VC world, from Silicon Valley, from back east, to say, the Wild West that Arizona is, it's really an opportunity. It's a meritocracy. You can come here, you can have freedom to explore these things. And so that's proven to be a success as well. Just like you can see driverless cars, we became, I think, state-wise, one of the best states in the country for these new financial instruments, the ways in which financial ledgers were being used, blockchain was being used.
Thank you. Great. And so, Derek, I know some exciting things are happening in Utah.
Yeah, thanks for having me here today. I really appreciate the invitation. And I was telling Danny when we sat down here that I saw that my first driverless vehicle when I was not in it, but in my Lyft from the airport coming over here. And that was not the amazing thing. The amazing thing was that I looked over and I saw there was no one in the car. I mean, no one driving, no one in the back seat. And I said to my Lyft driver, hey, there's no one in that car. And she was totally nonplussed about it. She's like, oh yeah, we have those all the places. And she knew all about it. Yeah. So I mean, if my Lyft driver knows about the innovation that's happening here, I think that says a lot. So in Utah, we also have the one-stop shop in our Department of Commerce, and we also have a regulatory sandbox. This was regulation or legislation that we helped to pass from the chamber a couple of years ago. It's been very effective. And then I'll tell you about a couple other things that we're doing specifically at our chamber. In the panel before us, it was about how to help minority-owned businesses. So we have the Salt Lake Chamber, and I should probably clarify that the Salt Lake Chamber functions as the Utah Chamber. We're essentially like the Arizona Chamber from a policy standpoint. There is no Utah Chamber of Commerce because we were founded 137 years ago when there was no Utah. I mean, we literally predate statehood. Wow. And there was only Salt Lake City. And people sometimes ask me, why don't you name yourself the Utah Chamber? And I say, well, after 137 years, there is some brand equity. And so, but from a policy standpoint, we function as the statewide chamber. And so we have a diverse-owned business accelerator in our chamber, which is really important to us to help businesses to participate in things like the regulatory sandbox. And then we have a women's business center that we run. And the third thing that I would mention, which is another private sector effort, which is to your question about how do we help these small businesses, it's access to capital. And so we were really proud that in Utah during the pandemic, we had the SBA small business loan leader in both the bank and the credit union. Both the credit union that had the most and the bank that had the most were both Utah institutions. So we were proud of that.
That's great. And I think you were one of the first states to create a fund of funds program.
And yeah, we created the Fund of Funds right when I moved back to my home state of Utah in 2005 under then Governor Huntsman. And in fact, it's funny that you had mentioned that because we just had the Chamber open house, and the original guy that we hired to run the Fund of Funds was there. I hadn't seen him in 15 years. And it was great to catch up with him. But at the end of our conversation, I looked at him and said, it worked. Hey, it worked, because we created the Fund of Funds in order to attract capital.
Right.
And once we did, we actually unwound it.
Right.
So government programs do go away sometimes once
Yeah.
they've fulfilled their mission.
Exactly. Thank you. So ASU Center for the Study of Economic Liberty released a Doing Business in North America report, which provides objective measures of business regulations across more than 80 U.S. cities. The report takes an in-depth look at regulations and enhance or constraints business activity and provides insight into economic outcomes. So how does a report like this support your work and the work of the chambers across the country? And I know you're both very active, not only in your own chambers, but nationally. So perhaps you can share some insight. So we'll start with you, Derek.
Well, first of all, since Salt Lake City was ranked number one, how we use it is we run around waving it, telling everybody about it. I mean, you know, a lot of, as you know, Sandra, a lot of this idea of competitiveness is tooting your own horn.
Right.
And maybe I should have apologized from the beginning that I'm here to brag about Utah and Salt Lake City. So
No apologies needed.
The reality of it is that nothing that you accomplish is ever done by accident. I've never met the business owner who accidentally started and ran a successful, profitable business. I never met a farmer who harvested a crop that he or she did not sow. I mean, it just doesn't happen. And so when you talk about whatever the ranking is, whatever the measure is, when you get behind that, there is a lot of hard work that goes into it by the public sector, by the private sector. And so how this report helps us, and hopefully everybody else, is to say, what are we doing well, and what can we work on?
No, I think that's excellent. Danny?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you to ASU for, giving our competitor a wonderful ranking on something. No, I'm kidding. Salt Lake City is a fantastic place to do business. We love going to Utah. We do study them. I think a report like that, to his point, it really does give us, at my level, an example of what do we need to be doing better at. If I recall from your report, Chandler is the highest ranked city with 24th, which I will, to toot our own horn for a second. Every year the chamber does a recognition of cities that best city to do business in Arizona. It was Chandler. So apparently we are onto something there because we did recognize the right city. Now, if I were to look at that list and to see who's in the top 5, if I recall, I know it's a lot of North Carolina cities, and we compete, and Sandra kind of leads the competitive economic development efforts for the state. We serve as a policy support for that, so I go to a lot of these meetings. I understand what other states have to offer. Sometimes when you get down to the city level, it's really interesting to see where things break down. Salt Lake City, for instance, and I'll steal maybe some of your thunder, they have TIFs, right? Tax increment financing. We don't have that in Arizona, but for one in Tucson, that was kind of the reason why all the others went away. That is such a useful tool for development. That is such a useful tool for, if we want to take, the downtown block, turn it into a sports and entertainment district, a TIF would be one of the best ways to do that. You could use a TIF to solve housing. You could use a TIF to solve so many things. But the policies coming out of the legislature have been so anti-TIF for so long, we've had to move away from that. So that puts the cities at a little bit of a disadvantage. I think we're going to be able to revisit that. The legislatures have cycled through. I think they're going to be back on the table. It's just something we can look at. But when it comes to how you rank states, I would proudly stand by where Arizona as a statewide organization goes into some of the other states. Utah's always up there as well, but Arizona fares very well in the statewide rankings. But our cities, we have some work to do. We need streamlined permitting. We need streamlined licensing, because the one thing I'll say about Arizona, he said, his organization predates Utah. Well, keep in mind, Arizona is the youngest state in the Great 48, right? We're not that old. We're a little bit over 100 years old ourselves. So the infrastructure that we have here is not is not built out yet. We're kind of building as we grow, and cities have to figure that out. Cities have to grow with that and accept that we're doing some smart growth. So I do think, again, lists like this are useful because it shows us what we need to work on and areas to improve on. I love to take that list down to Mayor Gallego, who's very great when it comes to economic development, and say, look what we could be doing better, though. We want to see this. We want to see Phoenix at the top of the list. So maybe when we're having an event hosted in our home state at our home college, we could be number one instead of these guys. But we'll keep trying.
No, and I think it's so important. Metrics are absolutely critical and essential because continuous improvement is what we all strive for. So I think it's really important. Derek, did you have something else?
Wanted to maybe just tell a quick story, if that's okay, to illustrate this point. So it was mentioned in the introduction that I served as a former governor of Utah, his chief of staff, and his name is Gary Herbert. And when I first came in as his chief of staff, it was during the Great Recession. And we were doing a visit to New York City and actually sat down with Steve Forbes. And I remember Governor Herbert said, hey, what is it going to take to be number one on your best states for business? Texas is always number one, and we want to be number one. And, he was kind of, having a fun time with it. But then the conversation got really serious. Steve Forbes said, well, here's what it's going to take. And we came back, and I remember Governor Herbert, actually on the plane ride back, he was like, Derek, we are setting a goal. We're going to be number one on the Forbes list. Yeah. And we did. We broke it down. I mean, we literally looked at where are we doing well, but where do we need to do work? And we focused on those areas. But the point I want to make is it's not about chasing grades, right? It's about being competitive and getting better, because the competition's trying to get better too.
That's right.
Yeah.
It's a roadmap. It allows you to stay focused. And so I think those reports are really essential. Next question is really about the federal government. And we've seen recent legislation such as the CHIPS Act and Infrastructure Investments and the Jobs Act, which aim to propel America's manufacturing industry and invest in critical infrastructure. What role do federal policies like these play in catalyzing economic development and business opportunities at a state and local level, and how does it create opportunities? So Danny, we'll start with you this time.
Sure. And as it was mentioned, I too worked in the governor's office prior to this job, and I was in charge of our federal policy. And when it comes to industrial policy, which is what we're talking about here, what the federal government does matter. And if you go just a quick history of the United States to watch where we've fared comparatively when it comes to manufacturing, we kind of gave away the farm. We let other countries come in and eat our lunch. When it came to memory chips, we used to be number one. Now South Korea, Japan, they came in, they took all that away. And a lot of it is based on this industrial policy. And what policy are you willing to set? I'm very proud of what our government has done in recognizing the importance of supply chain and semiconductors, and they've really switched it up with the CHIPS Act. Now, the CHIPS Act really does recognize that it's not only just about onshoring manufacturing jobs, which we want, or reshoring manufacturing jobs, but it is keeping our country safe, not being so dependent. When I went to college, everything was about globalization. Now it's a little bit different. Now there's an understanding you need different avenues to have your supply chain met. And so what the federal government has done with the CHIPS Act has really made it, just I would say, magnified what we are already doing at the state level. And that's kind of the neat thing about the way the CHIPS Act is written. It rewards states that have the right kind of programs already. So that's why you're seeing Arizona becoming the global semiconductor hub for the world right now, because we've put in those policies. That goes back 10 years in Arizona, as you know, following the Great Recession. We wanted a more diverse economy, we wanted to chase those manufacturing jobs. Now we're leading the country in advanced tech manufacturing growth. We're leading in foreign direct investment with over almost $60 billion in the last 2 years in foreign direct investment. I mean, it's amazing what we've been able to do, but it's a good partnership, I would say, with the federal government. Now, when they have the ability to hurt you as well. Mm-hmm. The policies that they take, if they get into tariffs and interfering with free trade, that also impacts what we can do at a state level as well. So we watch all that very closely. But again, I would say right now with CHIPS and science and with the investment into infrastructure with the IIJA, we've seen a lot of benefit from that as well in terms of our water infrastructure and our road infrastructure and energy infrastructure.
I think it really stems from a place of national and economic security based on the fact that the pandemic, I think, proved that we needed to do a better job of producing goods in the U.S. But Derek, do you want to
So
add to that?
specifically to the CHIPS Act, we were supportive of that as a chamber. We actually have already been able to capitalize that. Texas Instrument has started a large chips manufacturing plant just south of Salt Lake City. So for all the reasons that Danny stated, that's something we supported. But I also want to underscore what Danny said about sometimes it's too much or sometimes it's in the wrong direction. I mean, I referenced the Great Recession earlier. TARP 1 we were supportive of. TARP 2 went too far. In the pandemic recovery, we were supportive of 1 and 2. 3, once you start giving out free money to people, we're still bearing the burden of that today with the inflation we've been dealing with. And so sometimes it can be too far and sometimes it can be in the wrong direction. I worked for Congress, and I worked for a chief of staff on the transportation committee that was famous for saying there's no end to good ideas. And you have to make sure to put the good ideas in those air quotes, because everybody's got an idea and they all run to their member of Congress, and the good ideas are endless, and often Congress ends up focused in so many areas where they don't need to be focused on. But on the other hand, they're not putting time, energy, attention, and getting problems solved that they need to solve that are actually in their purview, like our broken immigration system and our workforce needs. And I mean, we could talk about that for the rest of the afternoon, but it's a frustration for us in Utah that is a fiscally sound state, that is a fiscally prudent state, but yet we're a state. We're not an island unto ourselves, and what happens on a national level, on a federal government level, impacts us. And so, I mean, as far as I would say philosophically, we have a philosophy when I was in the Economic Development Office, and that was you don't incent water to run downhill.
Right.
If this is something that's happening, you don't need to give an incentive for it. And we also had another philosophy, which was the government shouldn't do what the private sector can do. The government should not be competing with the private sector, and too often we run afoul of those principles.
He made me think of one thing. Yeah, much like their chamber, we supported the Chips and Science Act, as you could guess. We supported the IIJA, but when it came to the Inflation Reduction Act, which I don't even like calling it that, we opposed it. We were very much opposed to it. We worked very hard with Senator Kirsten Sinema to get certain amendments in to make it better and more palatable, and we got there, but still did not support it in the end because it had things like price controls and other things in it. But the point he just made about the role of what's private and what's public really does matter, because too often right now we are at this point where the federal government or sometimes state government is trying to do the job of the private sector, and that's not great. There's great examples of how you can have a public-private partnership, and we should look to that. I mean, there's a relatively unknown piece of legislation. It's probably the most important piece of economic legislation at the federal level for the last 50 years, and that's the Bayh-Dole Act. And what the Bayh-Dole Act did, since we're at ASU, is it allows universities to commercialize their IP that they've created. Because when they tried to do it on their own, there was about 5 patents out of 28,000 that ever came to market. So now they can work with our members to do that through tech transfers and all these other good ideas that are out there. That's been extremely successful. It has literally changed the DNA of our entire economy. So there's a good way to have a public-private partnership.
Yeah, I agree, and it actually touches on this question I'm about to ask, so perhaps you can elaborate a little bit more on policies that contribute to a regulatory environment that is favorable to economic development, but as we've also just heard, there are some policies that are not favorable. So what are some specific examples that you've seen? And this, this could be either at the federal level or at the state level.
So before I get to the specific example, let me just give the framework that I deal with. And that is the role of government, federal, state, local. Set the rules of the game, and then enforce so that everybody knows what they are, with transparency. Enforce the rules so that we have level playing fields. And then the one that I say colloquially, because I actually was a state regulator for a short period of time in our real estate industry, and I used to say, my job is to make things as easy as possible for the good guys and as hard as possible for the bad guys. So that's sort of my framework that I deal in. Now, as far as a specific example, the best one that I can think of is infrastructure. So it's the job of government to put in infrastructure. And when that is done, we get into a very nice virtuous cycle, because the private capital and the private development will follow that infrastructure. And that's true whether that's transit or other modes of transportation. That's true whether it's fiber and building a fiber background. I mean, whatever it is, there is a very clear and distinct role. And we see it happening now, just to get a little bit more specific. So we're expanding our front runner, which is our not high speed, but it's our commuter rail line. And we see development. We have a housing problem in Utah, meaning a shortage. But we see apartments going up in these transit-oriented developments like, weeds growing up. And it's just, every time I drive past any of these track stops, I just think this is exactly how it's supposed to work.
It's interesting, and I think housing is an issue across the country. So lots of different solutions, but Danny, do you have anything more you want to add?
No, sure. I mean, just to answer your question, good policy, bad policy, right? So right now, bad policy. I would argue what's happening at the federal level. You have good policy coming out of Commerce, that we've already talked about, CHIPS and Science Act. They're the agency responsible for implementing that. They're fantastic to work with. All of our chambers work with them in capitalizing already on the CHIPS and Science Act. Agency's not doing so well with us right now, our EPA. So I'll give you a good example. It comes up every now and then. We have an air quality situation in Arizona, right? We're in what's called non-attainment right now inside Maricopa County, where we're all sitting because of something called ozone. Now, 80% of ozone problem that we have comes from outside our state, and the majority comes from outside the country. We're downstream from Southeast Asia. That's who's producing it. Yet
I thought you were going to say Utah for a second. Thank you.
If I could blame, I would happily blame Utah if I could on this, but no. Unfortunately, it's Southeast Asia, it's California. We have the science, we can show that. Our members, our manufacturing community, have been reducing emissions for 40 years. We're doing everything right. Here's where the agencies, I think, get this policy wrong. If they want to come down on us hard for being in non-attainment, they're going to sanction what the solution is. The problem is Southeast Asia, the problem is California, yet they want to sanction the state that's downstream from it. It makes no sense, but that's how agencies and bureaucracies work sometimes. So that's an example of really bad policy. So we're doing our best to work with them on an international transport rule that would recognize that the problem's coming from China. Why would you want to incentivize them to pollute more? Shut down America, it's just going to go back overseas where they don't care about emissions. We care here, we're good actors. So the EPA is a great example of policy gone bad in the regulatory environment. It hurts permitting. All the wonderful things we're doing with the CHIPS and Science Act, when you have to do your NEPA, your EPA permit to start with on what your environmental impact is, that can take up to 2 years. You hear $40 billion, you want to see that go into the ground. I'm sure TI wants to get into the ground, but when that permitting process slows up, it's bad for everyone.
Yeah. Thank you. So what role, I mean, you guys are playing significant roles in your communities, but across the country. So what role does the Chamber play in economic freedom and creating more competitive environments for businesses?
So Danny and I were just chatting before we got started on our panel, and we were talking about business is in an interesting place. This is not just a Chamber of Commerce issue, it's a business private sector issue, because the one thing that the far left and the far right agree on is business is bad. And so, we were talking about coalition building, and certainly, understanding the landscape and being able to build those coalitions is important. I mean, at the end of the day, the Chamber of Commerce is the voice of business. And the reason why I think it's so, well, maybe two reasons why I think that voice of business is so important today is, number one, we've all seen the reports, we've all seen the data. Respect and trust in institutions is eroding, but not for your employer. Danny and I sit on the board for the U.S. Chamber, and so we go to these meetings, and they do a lot of polling. And small business, huge levels of trust. Your employer, huge levels of trust. And so being able to continue to use that trust wisely, earn that trust, It's really an important role of chambers across the country. And then the second one I would say is educational. Because some other data points that we see that are not as heartwarming is that with rising generation, more belief that maybe free enterprise is not the way to go, and rising interest in trying socialism. I mean, go to anybody who's over 50 and tell them this, they would not understand at all. Like, no, we know for a fact that this does not work. Why would we ever want, we know it works, we know it doesn't work, why would we ever want to turn back the clock? And so helping the rising generation understand the benefits that come from free enterprise and the perils that come from those command and control economies. I mean, look what's happening in China right now. You cannot control a free market economy through a command and control communist regime. It cannot be done. It may work for a short period of time, but in the end, it will fall apart.
Thank you, Danny.
Oh, it's really well said. I think that what we were just talking about in terms of where the young people are nowadays with communism or with socialism, it does blow my mind because, again, we don't have to guess what happens in those societies. We know, we have historical evidence and historical facts. Same is true with those types of policies that go hand in hand. We talk about price controls. Why do I get so passionate about price controls? Don't you want people to pay cheaper prices for medications? Price controls don't work. Rent controls don't work. Go to any city where rent controls are and tell me if it's cheaper there. It's not. So we don't have to guess what happens. So again, it's now more important than ever for our organizations like the Chamber to have that consistent position on free market, on the economy, on economic freedom. And again, we have to work so hard with our members. Why I know the polling from the U.S. Chamber very well. I know other polling that would show one thing that people don't like is when our members, business community, speak out on issues that don't impact their bottom line or get out there on social issues. And now we've seen businesses experience the consequence of that. So now more than ever, we have to get back to our roots, get back to economics, get back to finance, things that matter at the bottom line level, and not trying to tell people what we think culture should be. Instead, saying we're trying to give you opportunity to work. Because the free market, again, evidence-based, what I'm about to say, the free market is the best force for good in the world for advancing people through their standing. No one else has moved up in life and moved into better standing without the free market. It's the best assist there is. So we want to preserve that. We want to promote that wherever we go. And it's scary what we're up against right now.
So we're talking a little bit about economic theory right now, and we're here in an economic setting. So perhaps can you name for us some economic thinking that influenced you and your beliefs early on, and why?
So this was an interesting question. Spoiler alert, Sandra sent these questions to us in advance. And this is probably the one I thought the most about and came up with the least, interesting answer. And so then I had to think about, why can't I come up with a good answer on this one? And I thought, the problem with the question, no offense, is that there's risk inherent in the question, because as soon as you say, I like this type of economic theory, or I like this type of economic philosophy or thinker, then what you've done is it's easy to get dragged into then a debate about the theory. And I thought to myself, why do I not want to get dragged into a debate on the theory? And I thought, because I would rather focus on the facts. And it's just what we were talking about, what I said earlier and what Danny said earlier. I mean, the fact is that free enterprise has created more opportunity and more wealth for more people around the world than at any time in the history of the world. I mean, it's a fact. And I would rather deal with the facts.
That's good. Well, we can deal with the facts too, yeah.
I was going to say, Sandra knows this. I was just in Miami speaking on price controls and free market theory, and I didn't read the questions in advance until we were just outside. And I saw this one on there, and I was like, Same thing. I was like, that's an interesting question. Who is my most, you kind of cycle through, and he's got a really good point. If I were to tell you Adam Smith and The Wealth of Nations is a must read and one of my absolute most influential things I've ever read, he doesn't support industrial policy. I do. So you kind of get buried in, because the facts, by the way, the history of America is embedded with industrial policy too, going back to Alexander Hamilton. So again, it's you'd rather discuss the facts. You'd rather discuss, when someone says I'm a free market person, I don't like economic incentives. For what it's worth, it's about fair markets. And in order to have a fair market, you need incentives now. I mean, we're competing against countries that nationalize their utilities, nationalize their resources. We can't compete with that without some kind of policy at that level. So
sometimes markets fail.
And sometimes markets fail. And that's good, and that's important to recognize that. But yeah, and there's no, again, I think it's always good to read, Adam Smith. It's always good to read Keynes and understanding supply side and supply and demand economics. I agree with all of that, but I think studying history right now is so much more important. And I'll plug something that we're both part of. Again, the U.S. Chamber has started a national civics bee, and you're in this state right now that was the first in the country to require that you pass a civics test to get your high school diploma. That's exciting, because with institutions and trust institutions eroding away, we need to get back to civics. So the fact that the U.S. Chamber is doing this, our chamber is participating, Utah's going to be participating, that's a huge deal. It means a lot for us to get back to our roots and to understand what makes our country the way it is.
Yeah. Well, and I think we've heard over and over again in all of the questions how important free enterprises and economic freedom. So this is my final question. What's the one takeaway that you want people in this room to leave with?
That it's not a zero-sum game. I think, when you look at the study that was done, any of the studies, any of the rankings, Forbes, U.S. News, Wallet Hub, all the rest, sometimes you can get the impression that, we're always going to be ranked. So what one community does, one city, one state does, that's the way it will always be. But what I love about the true and correct principles of economic development is they can be applied by anyone, anywhere, and they will get the same outcome. Now, you got to tailor it for the community, but when people figure out what works for them, and that's why talking about competitiveness, I think is such a great way to describe it. Not every team in the NFL competes the same way, but they figured out what works for them, and then they work hard at it, and then they practice, and then they employ true and correct principles, and then they win. And that can be true, whereas there only one team is going to win the Super Bowl in a few weeks. Right. It's probably not going to be the Arizona Cardinals, sorry. But
definitely not going to be the team from Utah that doesn't exist.
It won't be the team from Utah that doesn't exist. But that is not true in economic prosperity. Right. Every team can win.
Yep, you're right. And the idea around competitiveness is so important, because it's not a zero-sum game. And when we set up the legislation in 2011, our package was called the Competitiveness Package. It was the creation of the Economic Development Organization and the tools, but it was centered around competition and how we can improve, what we were doing here in Arizona. So I love that. Danny?
Yeah, no, Sandra, I would just build on your answer from my answer. It's a great point. For me, if you take away one thing, take away this: policy matters. Going back to 2008, the Great Recession, we were a construction economy. We were, tourism. Right. That's it. That's all we really had. Services-based economy. And the same could be true for the country once upon a time. Policy has changed all of that for Arizona. It was not by accident. There were certain people in a room back in 2008 through 2010 who said, we don't want to be the slow state to recover from a recession ever again. We need to diversify our economy. What does that take? So you saw Jobs Bill 1, Jobs Bill 2, which are the competitive packages that created the Commerce Authority that changed some of our, I would say, our incentives are really unique in Arizona. If I can make this point really fast too, they're what we would call non-discretionary. So we're not picking winners and losers. We've created an environment where everyone can be a winner, but you have to hit certain metrics. And that has worked. It has worked. It's irrefutable. This does not happen without the policies we pass. You heard from earlier when you met with Governor Herbert. They went to Forbes. They said, "What do we have to do to get into the top?" They got there by coming up with a plan and a roadmap, and I'm sure a lot of that was policy based. I know some of the policies in Utah, as a matter of fact. We steal when we can. We borrow their ideas all the time, search and reapply, around the whole country. Indiana had a great one that we took and stole and moved into ours as well. So policy matters. And just as good policy gets us to where we are right now with all these big announcements, I mean, I can't imagine that we're saying this, but there was an announcement that was like worth a few $100 million in a few jobs, and we're like, this isn't even going to make the news anymore. But that was all. That we were lucky to get that once a quarter, 10 years ago. Now we're in the billions, and the billions are the ones that get the news. But that can all go away with bad policy too. So we have to keep our momentum going. We have to keep our eye on the prize. Know what we're competing with. Drive-by shot on the Arizona Cardinals will be much better next year. They're a board member of mine, so I'll stand up for their owner, Michael Bidwell, is fantastic. He's a board member of the ACA. He does a great job.
And by the way, I was always a huge Fitzgerald fan.
Well, we're still big Larry Fitzgerald fans. He's a Chamber Heritage Award winner, fantastic guy. So policy matters. Pay attention to the policy at the state level and at the city level, and you'll continue to see good growth in your state.
Excellent. Thank you both so much. This has been just a really enjoyable conversation. I don't know if we have time for questions at all. Okay, so we'll open it up for some questions. Yes.
Okay, it's a little long, but not too long, so just bear with me. My question is on foreign aid. How can we use, and it's relevant to what your guys' expertise is, I swear. My question is on foreign aid. How can we use foreign aid to encourage economic development and humanitarian goals of countries or places that suffer from corruption and poverty with low social mobility? You can also answer in terms of domestic policy in relation to government grants.
I missed the first one.
Yeah.
Foreign aid.
Foreign aid.
Foreign aid.
Okay.
So I'm a fan of foreign aid. To me, I look at almost everything that the government does, federal, state, or local, as is it an investment? Is it an investment for the future? And I view foreign aid as an investment because I'd rather be spending money to help countries develop than spending money fighting wars.
I'm a big fan of foreign aid as well. I do think, I'm intrigued by this new isolationism that's growing within, I would say, both the Republican Party and one side of the Democratic Party. I think what we do in the world matters. America, I think, does have a role in that. I think the message that we put out really does matter. And the more we invest overseas, it saves us problems back here as well. Again, we have historical evidence of this. When we decide not to lead, a price is paid globally. So again, I am a fan of foreign aid. I am a fan of course, it being attached to strings, and of course, it having oversight. But I think what we do in the world matters, and it's not just on the economy, in terms of I would say our role in humanity and our role in history and how that's written. So I'm a fan.
Yes.
Thanks very much for the panel. I'm the department head for the school that hosts the Center for the Study of Economic Liberty, and both the school and the center and another center that we have, the Center for American Civics, very interested in the nexus of these issues. So I'm glad that the panel did address the civic education question. So we've known for several years about Mike Carney and his efforts at the National Chamber with civics and the Civics Bee. My question for all three of you is, given steps that have already been taken, what further signals can the Chamber and other leading civil society organizations, what further signals could be made to state superintendents of education, public universities, even private universities, that this really is an urgent priority? Try to find some political consensus about the priority of citizenship education, citizenship preparation, to include knowledge of the fundamental free market principles and enduring debates about free market principles in our country, so that the next generation, the rising generation of leaders and citizens, is prepared to face this extraordinary but also complicated world that we're in. What further things would you recommend to be done?
So I would answer that with this example. It sounds like Utah has, similar to Arizona, civics education requirement, which we've got. We also have, as an example, financial literacy. And I'm going to use the example of financial literacy to hopefully make the point here at the end. I've got 3 kids who all went through high school. They all graduated. They all took the financial literacy test, and they all learned how to balance a checkbook. They don't have a checkbook.
Right.
I mean, passing the law was one thing. How it got implemented was completely different. So what more we can do is, in addition to having a law that says you've got to take a civics class, you've got to take a citizenship class, let's make sure that it's the right class. I mean, that the curriculum is actually right. That's what comes to my mind is, sometimes we say, we passed the law, we did it, yay. And then we don't even know what's being taught.
Yeah. It's not an easy question, unfortunately, because I think you can see where people get their news from. This confirmation bias is amazing. If I want to read something that says America is evil, I'll find my sources right now. If I want to read something that says America is great, I'll find my sources right now. So that confirmation bias is a problem. And I'm glad that this civics education has spread as much as it has. I'm glad we were the first state to require it. But he's right, it's not enough. Being able to answer 10 questions before you graduate it isn't enough to understand why the judiciary is so important, why an independent judiciary matters, or why elections matter, and why we have the history of peaceful transfer that's never been interrupted in history before. This stuff really needs to. You're right. I think needs to be modernized on how it's taught. We need to meet the younger generation where they are. We need to do a better job of that in a lot of levels. We also have financial literacy, I should say, as well. Maybe that one we copied from Utah. Who knows? But I do think more needs to be done there. And I would add, I was so impressed to see. I have 3 children, and my daughter is my middle child. In her 3rd grade, they taught citizenship. They taught what does it take to become, an American citizen. It was a 3-week, course she took. And when she would come home and talk to me about it, I said, our former general counsel is now a federal judge, and every Friday he does, he swears in new citizens to the country. You want to come to the courthouse? And I took her to the courthouse, and that day it was over 107 people became American citizens from over 27 countries. And she was in tears. Like, my daughter was moved by the people who spoke. I don't think she'll ever forget that. And we wrote a story about it for Chamber of Business News. It's by far, which has 40,000 subscribers. I think in the end, it was our most viral piece just about my daughter going to this. So there's a hunger for it. I'm proud of her school for doing that. I think other schools should do that as well. And I think as parents, we all have a role to do that too for our kids. I mean, we have to pass on the knowledge of what makes our country great, because they're not hearing that from TikTok or wherever else they're getting news from right now.
Those are great. Next question. Yeah, back here.
Hello, I am ASU student, and my question, there was statement that already some states have policies and regulations, and even if we are in the free market, we cannot do completely free because they already have regulation. Why is that? Why it wouldn't work?
I think it goes back to a comment I made earlier, which is in order to have free markets, you have to have some regulation. We talked about the driverless vehicle. You imagine if there was no regulation going on with the driverless vehicles. I mean, it wouldn't work. If there were no traffic laws, it wouldn't work. We'd just lock up. So I've never been of the belief that having a free market means there's no regulation. I think you have to have it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a society requires rules and regulations to function. I mean, if you want to see a good example of why rules and regulations are helpful sometimes, wonder why our country is developed the way it has versus some underdeveloped countries, and get into private property rights. In America, we have some of the greatest laws around private property rights. We do. Go to certain continents where they don't have that. There's no investment being made. There's no market there at all because you can't trust that your private property will be protected. So that's just one example of why rules and regulations matter. Now, there's over-regulation and over-rules, and the idea, I think, of a free market is really minimal rules and regulations that allow the market to dictate more on the supply and demand and price side of things. That's more when we talk about free market and rules and regulations, not to get into, again, ancient theory, but that's kind of where it really comes down, is more on how you determine prices, how you let it be supply and demand.
So can I just share a really quick experience? So I mentioned I was a regulator for a short period of time, And I moved back from Washington, D.C. to Utah, worked at the Department of Commerce, and my very first day on the job, I went out to a speaking engagement and gave a speech. I didn't know what I was talking about because it was my first day on the job. A person raised his hand and he said, why when we change our why when we move and we need to update our license, why do we have to mail in a change card? And I said, what the heck's a change card? And I did say heck because I'm from Utah. And he said, it's something we have to fill out whenever anything on our license changes. And we literally have to mail it in. We can't fax it in. We can't email it in. We can't. And I said, I don't know. So I went back to the office and I asked our head of our licensing division, why do they have to mail in the change card? And he went and got a binder. It was literally that thick. Everything was printed on goldenrod. And he flipped it open, colored paper, and flipped it open, and he looked at chapter and verse of where it was, and he said, it's right there, must mail in. Right. And then my eye caught down on the corner, right-hand corner, bottom of the page was a date. It was April 1972 that regulation had been put in.
Yes.
And here's the true irony of it. We made the regulations. We made them. And I said, what would it take to change this regulation? And he said, oh yeah, we just have to go through this rulemaking process. And I said, why don't we do it? Yeah, we can do it, no problem.
Yeah.
But it takes somebody, we talked about the regulatory sandbox, it takes somebody to actually do that. My governor that I worked for used to always say, regulations are like weeds in a ditch. They just grow. Nobody knows where they came from. Yeah. And every once in a while, you have to go in and you have to clean out the weeds in the dish in order for commerce to flow.
Yeah, that's so true. I think your example is such a good one because we need to be looking at things all the time. And so many people are so accustomed to a regulation being in place and have no idea why.
They can't remember where it came from. They can't remember why they had it.
And they just said, I've got, I'm reading this book and this is why. But modernizing them and adapting them to the current situation, I think is so important.
No, yeah. And, in Arizona, it's a little bit different, but we have universal licensing recognition. So you can come from almost anywhere and have your license recognized, state to state. There's, widespread reciprocity. So anything that's a barrier to entry, a barrier to work, we've tried our best to get rid of here. And we're looking at doing it for more foreign workers as well when we can, when there's a need for it too. So it's a great example of when regulation should be looked at.
Yeah. Any other questions? Or I think we've got one more here. Or when...
This was before I moved to Arizona. We created a smaller version of this report, the Doing Business report. We looked only at the category of opening a business. What does it take in each of the states to open a business? And I was conversing with a graduate of the program I had been teaching in at Michigan State. And she was talking about, she was trained as a lawyer, but had stepped out of her profession to have kids. So returning to the market later, she didn't want to re-up her legal education. So she decided to open a business in which she would take as customers people who were from Michigan but no longer living in Michigan, who had elderly parents who still lived in Michigan and were facing medical issues. And she made herself like a court reporter. She made herself a reporter for the family. So she had a business where she was hired by the children of a senior citizen who was having medical care in Michigan, but the children were outside Michigan. They would hire her, and she recorded the data, and she decided that she got so much business that she needed to hire an employee, and she thought that this was too important information to hire people on a 1099. She wanted to make them an employee so that she could say to the people, no, they're under my control. And she called the office in the Department of Employment and Economic Growth. That was what it was called at that point in time. And and asked the woman to help her walk through some of the steps in terms of starting a business. And after 4 or 5 phone calls, the woman said, you know, dear, you keep calling me back, asking me to, the steps in the process. She said, I don't understand why you're calling me. You have a lawyer. Use your lawyer to do this work for you, because you can't do it by yourself. We intend it to be done by lawyers. And the woman said, I am trained as a lawyer, but I'm not currently a lawyer, and I don't have the money to hire a lawyer. And the woman said to her, well, then I have no idea how you can start a business in the state of Michigan, and hung up on her. So there you go.
It's a plug for lawyers.
Well, it's just one of those examples of how the rules end up within the agency end up dominating the experience of the marketplace as the market changes, and new methods of interacting. For example, at that point in time, the Department of Labor and Economic Growth didn't have a very good website. Right? So all those kinds of things compound. So.
I think it comes down to how we communicate some of these guidelines, right? I mean, we could make it easier, and I think that's what we've attempted to do in Arizona, is how to make it easier for people to understand that so they don't have to get a lawyer. And then making sure that those who are answering the phone or answering those questions are knowledgeable about it. Because if they're not, then ultimately you're ending up with, the challenge that you've described, which doesn't serve anyone well.
This is a silly example, but when I worked in government, I used to have all of my employees fill out the forms that they would require somebody to fill out.
Yep.
There's no easier way to find out whether a form is actually understandable to fill out than to have the person who made the form fill it out.
That's right, yeah. I don't know what our time commitment is here. So
We can do one more question.
Okay, thank you.
I only have one question, but I also want to ask, is there going to be another panel of speakers afterwards? Okay, in that case, can I make it 2 questions, and they're very brief? It's depending on the speakers. I don't want to disrespect your time. Okay, my question is, I'm running for a school governing board next year, so my question is, what can we do to encourage making required life economics, financial literacy, and civics classes in schools?
We should let the ASU alum answer that.
Oh, good cop out. No, I because it's already required by statute, I think the next best thing would be to go to the State Board of Education, who kind of governs our curriculum, and to work with them on making sure there's a more robust curriculum around those 2 topics. I think that would be a good place to start. That's a group that's appointed by the governor and several others, but they oversee curriculum. Speaking of civics, sometimes people don't understand who governs what in a state sometimes, kind of like when you get a teacher strike because the governor's not paying them enough. Well, the governor doesn't pay teachers, a little known fact, apparently. But on this, I would get to the State Board of Education, who works with the curriculum models.
Awesome, thank you, very useful. And can I say one last thing? It's short, but if not, it's okay, I understand.
Sure.
Okay, thank you. So I'm also a business owner and a fashion designer. Business is called Spice Run. I'm currently working on growing it. Anyway, so what ways can I use my business and my platforms to encourage interest in civics, finance, and economics?
Talk to your employees. I mentioned before, employers and small businesses are some of the most trusted institutions in our country. So you've got a lot of influence. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, please join me in thanking Derek and Danny for all of the great work. Thank you. And thank you for inviting us.